Custom tailored union suits that cost him 20 bucks a pair in 1920s money. It's like $500 underwear if you adjust for inflation. Now, I can't trace him to the LaSalle Wacker building, this one on the right with the flag from 1930. I can't trace his gang there. In 33, after Capone was in prison, they were using the room on the 8th floor as a headquarters under the leadership of a guy named Frank the Enforcer Nitti. Now, Nitti was not quite as good at Capone as hiding from the cops. The cops broke into there one day in 33, shot Frank the Enforcer Nitti up pretty good. They didn't kill him, but it's not like he lived to a ripe old age or anything. Very few of the gangsters did. Gang lord was not a job where you got to have a long life expectancy. But you did get to buy really nice underwear while you were here. So sometimes you just have to make a decision about what's really important to you, you know? On the right, 77 Wacker, the United Building, 1990 to Stefano and Partners, Ricardo Bofil, the architect. We're going to try to latch onto the drum sound here. Up along the top, you can see the row of columns. It's a postmodern take on the Rosa Greek columns. Got a pediment roof like an old Greek temple. 4 of the columns extend clear down. That's all close. 4 of the columns in the middle extend all the way down to tie the entire building together. Endlessly classical, endlessly modern at the same time. I don't think that one's ever going to go out of style. Directly ahead, the small white cone-shaped building is the 17th Church of Christ Scientist by Harry Weiss, same guy who did that preservation building. And climbing into the sky to the right with the green tower is probably my favorite of them all, the Carbide and Carbon building from 1930 by Burnham and Burnham, Daniel Burnham's sons. Now, according to legend, they wanted that to look like an Art Deco version of a champagne bottle. And nobody's ever found an interview where they actually said that themselves, so it might just be an urban legend. But it does kind of look like a champagne bottle. Okay, I don't know if I can do that, but honk, honk! And in 1930, that would have been kind of charmingly subversive on their part. Prohibition was going on, champagne wasn't legal. But it's been estimated that under Prohibition, the number of places in Chicago where you can go to get a drink just about tripled. It's hard to know for sure, though, those illegal speakeasies were not keeping very good paperwork. So we end up with a lot of different urban legends about them. Like, people love to say, under the dome of the Jewelers building on the right here, people love to say Capone had a speakeasy under the dome there. It's kind of half true. There was a club under the dome called the Stratosphere Club, but not until years after Prohibition ended and after Capone was safely in prison. So it's one of those Chicago stories that isn't exactly true, it just should be true. And we have a lot of those. In fact, 1895, the Philadelphia Inquirer said Chicago is the greatest city in the world for things to happen that never happened. On the right, the skinny skyscraper is called Mather Tower from 1930. They intended to have 2 of those, but 1930 happened and they ran out of money. The London House, the glass next to it, is a new glass addition to the London Guarantee Building on the left, a 1920s building by Alfred Alschuler. It's all just been redone as a hotel called the London House. So named after a jazz club that was in the building back in the 50s and 60s. You can go on Spotify right now, look up Sarah Vaughan live after hours at the London House, Oscar Peterson Trio live at the London House, both recorded live right in there. Just beyond that, the Art Deco 333 North Michigan is based on the design that came in second when the Chicago Tribune had a contest as to who could design their new office tower. The winning design became the Chicago Tribune building. There's one currently under construction up over here. They've just been redoing it. Kind of looks like a Disney villain castle to me. Before we get up to that one, though, well, first I want to call out Low Bridge for the next one coming. But also, to the left of that, you can see this one with the yellow onion dome, the Intercontinental. And that building insists that when they first designed that thing that looks like a chimney up there was supposed to be a landing pad for Zeppelins. Blimps. Because it was the 1920s. They're thinking, you know, in 5 years, everybody's going to be traveling around in Zeppelins. Well, if we don't have a landing pad, we will be obsolete. Low Bridge, watch out. Anyway. They never used it once. It never would have worked. But now blocking our view, the Chicago Tribune building, Howells and Hood, 1924, one of the last of the great Gothic skyscrapers. They are working on turning it into condos now. But about a year ago, the old cartoonist at the Tribune called me up and said, hey, my key card still works. Do you want to go in and smoke cigars and break stuff? I'm like, yeah, I want to go in and smoke cigars and break stuff. So we spent a day like throwing bricks through the drywall. And there's a rumor that Chance the Rapper wants to buy one of the condos, so we left a lot of hidden welcome Chance messages written on the bricks. I hope some of them survive. I kind of doubt they will, but still. Coming up on the left, rising to the sky with the NBC Peacock up top. This is the NBC Tower from the 1980s. We're supposed to call this one postmodernism just because it's from the 80s, but really it is more Art Deco than Art Deco with its clean lines, streamlined verticality, simple geometric art. I love this one. It's my favorite Adrian Smith building by far. I always feel like Superman ought to be flying around the spire. If that were my building, that would drive me nuts. I'd be up there like taping yardsticks onto the spire all the time trying to get it over 1,000. Maybe they get a tax break by staying under, I don't know. Over on the right now, behind these rather bland-looking modernist buildings, you can see this one with all of the wavy balconies up there. Kind of gives the impression like the whole building is made out of liquid. That is called Aqua Tower, primarily residential. Lady Gaga had a place there for a while. When it was built, it briefly held the distinction of being the tallest building in the world, designed primarily by a woman, Chicago architect Jeannie Gang. And it didn't hold the record for very long, but Jeannie Gang is about to take the record back. You see this building that's coming up as we go under the bridge. It's under construction and just keeps going up and up and up. This is called the Wanda Vista Tower by Jeannie Gang and Studio Gang, 1,250 feet tall, same height as the Empire State Building. Now you notice up towards the top there is a part where the floors are kind of further apart than the others. That's because you might have heard someplace that tall buildings are known to sway in the wind a little bit. Officially, they don't sway, what they do is give, but that means basically the same thing. So, one this close to the water is especially vulnerable to that, so that empty space up there is going to be what's called a blow-through floor, something we've never done in Chicago before. Just a big empty space for wind to blow through. You got to be careful when you do that. They have done it in other cities, and if you're not careful, you can turn the entire building into the world's largest whistle. And I mentioned that to somebody who lived in the building next door a while ago, and they were like, what? Studio Gang knows their stuff, though. Over on the left, we have got this fountain known as Centennial Fountain, built to commemorate the 100th anniversary of a group that pulled off probably our greatest engineering feat when they reversed the whole flow of this river in the early 20th century. See, the river used to flow out to the lake about like you'd expect it to. Trouble is, the lake is our drinking water. And into the river, we were pouring all of our sewage, all of our garbage that would float out of the lake, and we would drink it right back up. Which is not just disgusting, it is also a fantastic way to spread cholera and dysentery and all of those Oregon Trail diseases. So in what may have been the most Chicago moment of all time, instead of saying, hey, we should stop polluting the river, they decided, hey, let's push the whole river backwards. So that's what they did. They dug a canal that was deeper than the lake. The lake started flowing into the canal. Long story short, the whole river got pushed backwards. So now all of our sewage would be sent to St. Louis instead. Yay! Boy, does St. Louis love us for that. All the other cities on the Mississippi, too. Riverview 2 and Riverview 1, a couple of newer DeStefano and Partners buildings. I understand they finally found a buyer for the penthouse on Riverview 1. It was on the market for years for $12.9 million. 9,600 square feet and includes a private basketball court. But how would you like to live in a condo underneath the basketball court? I lived next door to a guy with a knife throwing kit for a while. That was fun enough. And over here behind the white wall on the left is nothing. Absolutely nothing. Which breaks my heart because they were planning on building a really fantastic skyscraper there called the Chicago Spire. It was going to be 2,000 feet tall, very distinctive corkscrew shape. Would have become an instantly recognizable symbol of the city as well as the tallest in the country. Our mayor at the time even said it was going to be like the Statue of Liberty of Chicago, like a welcoming beacon to the city. You know, for all of the pilgrims who sail across Lake Michigan looking for a better life every year. But 2008 happened, the economy tanked, they ran out of money, all they ever managed to do was dig out the core support, so now we just have like a bottomless pit over there. Every few months I see a new design for something someone's planning to build there. So far nothing has happened. But hopefully they'll turn it around soon. And over on the left, this is the world's largest fidget spinner. That was the joke of the year 2 years ago. Actually, this is called Lake Point Tower, based on a design by Ludwig Mies van Roo, the guy we normally associate with plain black boxes. See, in the wilder days of his youth, before he discovered the rigid joys of the rectangle, he was designing much curvier buildings, including a clover-shaped office tower for Berlin. And that one never got built, but his students found the design 40 years later, used it as an inspiration for Lake Point Tower, which is mostly residential. For years, tour guides used to tell people that Oprah lived in the circular thing up top. They have a plaque in the building that says Oprah never lived here, just to clear that up. What's actually up top is a French restaurant called Cité. It looks like it ought to be a revolving restaurant, but it just sits there. Speaking of revolving, though, they do have a new Ferris wheel at Navy Pier. It replaces a slightly smaller, older one, which was taken down a couple of years ago and sent to Branson, Missouri to be rebuilt, which makes it part of a grand tradition in Chicago of sending our old Ferris wheels to Missouri. So besides all of the sewage, the first really large Ferris wheel ever built was the one for that World's Fair in 1893. After they were finished with that one, they sent it to Missouri for the St. Louis World Fair in 1901. My great-great-grandfather rode it while he was in St. Louis, loved it so much he became a carny for 5 years. Such was the magic of the Chicago Ferris wheel. Coming up over on the left-hand side here, this is Navy Pier. I got to admit, Navy Pier has really stepped up their game in the last couple of years. There's a lot more local things than they used to have there, like the Giordano's for deep dish, Harry Carey's, Goddess and the Baker, Big City Chicken. There are even 2 places in there where you can try the real Chicago treat. At the DMK Burger Bar in Billy Goat, there's a thing called Jepson's Malort. It's a drink you normally only get in old-school Chicago bars. It's a liqueur that tastes like... Did you ever get a root canal? You know that taste in the back of your throat during a root canal? If you mix that with loneliness, that is the taste of Jepson's Malort. Alright, so I'm going to get off mic for just a second as we turn around here so everybody has a chance to get this photo of the skyline that is about to come up on your right-hand side. This is one of the best views in the city. You can only get it from right here. I'll stay ducked out of the pictures for a minute. Coming up on the right over there is a space called DuSable Harbor. DuSable Harbor named after Jean-Baptiste Point DuSable, our first known non-native settler who came here in the 1770s. You think he was a fur trader from Haiti, though nobody's really sure. There's only about 3 sentences of good primary source data about the guy. The city started to grow in the 1830s, so he officially incorporated as a city in 1837. There's a great outstanding legend that in those days to incorporate you needed 150 votes. And it was unanimous when they held the referendum, but only 140 people showed up to the polls, so 10 of them got back in line and voted again. Which is another of those great Chicago stories. It doesn't really hold up to research, in fact, not a bit. It's another of those great Chicago stories that isn't exactly true, it just should be true. And of course, we got an awful lot of those, but even some of the wilder ones, you do the research and find out it's at least a lot closer than you would have thought, and sometimes even wilder. Like some of the stories about where the land itself comes from around here. Lake Michigan used to go all the way out to Michigan Avenue, 2 bridges down, hence the name Michigan Avenue, in fact. What happened over on the left-hand side here is after the Great Chicago Fire, when the whole city burned down in 1871, we rebuilt very quickly, but we were left with this massive pile of rubble, dust, and ash. So they took that massive pile of rubble, dust, and ash and pushed it out into the water, creating Grant Park and everything you can see over here on the left. What happened on the other side, over on the right, was actually even a little bit stranger than that. Over on the right-hand side, this was still the lake up through about the 1880s. But 1888, a guy named Captain George Wellington Streeter crashed his houseboat onto the shore. Now, for years, you would say that he crashed during a terrible storm. Later research showed there was no storm that night. But he crashed onto the shore and started charging people money to dump their garbage around his ship. And the city just let it happen because they were working on filling in that land anyway. But they didn't realize quite what a weirdo they were dealing with here. Captain Streeter eventually created this 186-acre landfill that we're sailing past. And being a bit of an eccentric, he decided that not only did he own this new land he had created, he decided it was his own independent country of which he was the emperor. And it took the cops 30 years to get rid of the guy. And it wasn't just legal battles either. There was a whole, they had a whole army of hobos that he'd allowed to emigrate to his new country. Now and then they would actually have gunfights with the cops. But finally in 1918, he lost the Battle of Garbage Hill once and for all. Ended up spending the last couple of years of his life selling coffee at what was then known as Municipal Pier out over there. But over on the other side of Riverview 1 and Riverview 2, at the intersection of Grand and McClurg, we now have a life-size statue of Captain George Wellington Streeter. So that's how we treat our criminals and pirates here in Chicago. We make statues of them. So to put a few things in perspective, at the time Captain Streeter first crashed ashore in 1888, we had about 1 million people living in the city. 50 years before, we'd had about 3,000. Now, it took ancient Rome about 800 years to get to 1 million people. It took London over 1,000 years to get to 1 million people. In Chicago, we did it in 50. No city had ever grown that quickly before, and all this was during right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, so it might seem like a logical place to be the birthplace of the skyscraper. Which is what we are, but it's not quite as logical if you look at the soil around here. It's a very wet, marshy soil. Early skyscrapers were a lot heavier. If they got above 10 or 11 stories, they would start to sink into that wet, marshy soil. But we had an architect here named William Jenny who solved the problem. He developed what we call steel frame construction. The idea is you just build a skeleton for the building out of steel, then all of the brick, all of the glass, all of the masonry, all of the stone, all of that just gets draped over that skeleton like a curtain. That allowed for him to, for much lighter buildings. It allowed William Jenny to build the first modern skyscraper anywhere right here in Chicago in 1881, a place called the Home Insurance Building, which I won't be showing you today because they tore it down in 1931. Well, depending on who you believe, April 1st of 1907, the Chicago Tribune announced that the Home Insurance Building had been destroyed by dinosaurs. It was April Fool's Day, and they had way too much fun with it at the Chicago Tribune that year. But we became not only the birthplace of the skyscraper, but by some metrics, even the skyscraper capital of the world. Everywhere you go around here, the more you know about it, the more it starts to feel like a museum. You walk around and you're like, wow, there's a Louis Sullivan, there's an actual Daniel Burnham, there's a William Jenny that's somehow still standing. You can start to appreciate Ludwig Mies van der Rohe after a while. And sometimes built right into the architecture, you can see little hints about our history, little hints about the ways that we tried to solve problems over the years. Well, this is a lot of traffic on the river today. It's our air and water show weekend, you expect that kind of thing. So, this whole space over here was still land controlled by Captain Streeter during the 1910s. There was a lot of development on there, but it was mostly whiskey bars and bohemian dens all through the 1910s. What is now known as Michigan Avenue, the Magnificent Mile, did not yet exist. In fact, Michigan Avenue stopped being Michigan above the river and became a dirt road called Pine Street. This was also an area for a while called the Sands, which the Chicago Tribune described as the area that is not ornamental to our morals. But 1920 came around. When 1920 came around, Captain Streeter was gone. They were building the Michigan Avenue Bridge, so everybody knew that this was going to become the Magnificent Mile. And the first skyscraper built to anchor it was the Wrigley Building, this gorgeous white one coming up on the right, based on a cathedral in Seville, Spain, Graham Anderson Probst and White 1920, the anchor of the Magnificent Mile, built for William Wrigley Jr., the same guy whose name is on Wrigley Field. Now, he's the Wrigley Spearmint Gum guy. And one of the things that made William Wrigley Jr. such a success, it was not just that his gum was so good, it's that his advertising was so good. He was one of the first guys to have giant electric billboards all over Times Square. So when he announced that he was building his skyscraper right here, that was going to anchor the new Magnificent Mile and probably set the tone for it as well. But everybody kind of assumed, you know, he spends $500,000 a year on those Times Square billboards. Surely he's going to save himself some money and just have one all over the face of this one. Nobody would have blamed him for that, in fact. So that would have set the tone for the Magnificent Mile, though. Instead of going for really upscale and elegant like they eventually did, it probably would have been kind of like the Times Square of the Midwest. But he kind of surprised everybody. He announced, no, that's not what I want to do with the Wrigley. Oh, here's a low bridge coming up. Low bridge. Low bridge. All right. So he announced that, no, I just want the most beautiful and elegant office building in the world. No advertisements, just a small plaque on the first floor that says Wrigley Building. And we loved him for it. Al Chase of the Chicago Tribune published a huge editorial in 1920 praising William Ridley Jr. to the sky for not putting his name on the building in giant letters. And other architects took notice of that. They kept on building in that same Beaux-Arts style, like the London Guarantee, even after Art Deco took over, just so they would continue to fit in with the Wrigley building. That's the kind of thing architects do have to think about, too. Like, when Adrian Smith was designing 401 Wabash here, he had to think, how am I going to make this fit in with the rest of the buildings, even though it's going to be 3 times the size? He did this with a little tricks called contextualism, ways that he kind of give shout-outs to the environment. Like, you see this first setback here where it stops rising up. That is set at the same height as the setback on the Wrigley building. Next setback up over there is set at the same height as the next building coming up. Can't quite see it yet because we're too far over to the side. But the black one coming up next. And the setback on the left-hand side is set at the same height as these 2 corncob-looking buildings coming up over beyond that, Marina City. So that little subtle detail helps tie all of these buildings together, makes them look as though they belong together. Which is not easy to do, but Adrian Smith is a very clever architect. Now the black one, the IBM building, now the AMA building, is a Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, one of his last American buildings. Other architects were starting to go back to ornamentation by then, but he just wanted to emphasize the simple beauty of the raw materials. Other architects were back to ornamentation. He would stand in front of his students and just hold up a brick and stare at it as they behold the brick. It'll mean a much thicker German accent than I can probably fake. So one of his students was a guy named Bertrand Goldberg, who went on to design Marina City, these corncob-looking things. Now, Goldberg was, believed in a lot of the tenets of modernism, but he didn't like all of the rectangles, obviously. Now, as an architect, he wasn't just being an architect when he designed these. In his heart of hearts, he was kind of a city planner, too. This was an era, the late 50s, early 60s. Everybody was leaving the city to go live in the suburbs. He wanted to draw people back downtown, first of all by offering them parking spaces, which most buildings didn't have at the time. But when it was finished, these were mostly residential, but he described it as like a city within a city. Besides the apartments and parking spaces, there was a grocery store, there were offices, there was a theater, even a bowling alley, for those were bowling days, and most men bowled hard. They were thought of as the most modern buildings in the world at the time, and they still look pretty strikingly modern to me now, but they're not quite as modern in their functionality anymore. These buildings are all made out of concrete. Concrete buildings are where cell phone signal goes to die. But concrete was all the rage at the time. This was the age of the brutalists, the massive concrete buildings that were all the rage in the 60s and 70s. Think of like shopping malls and hospitals from the 60s, college campus buildings, parking garages from the 70s. These massive hulking slabs of concrete that were all the rage. Now there's one on the left here with the 55, the old Blue Cross building, 55 Wacker. This is a very restrained example of brutalism. Usually we think of much more concrete than that. This specific one was designed by a guy named Otto Stark, which I always thought was nature's perfect name for a brutalist architect. I've been saying that for years. 3 months ago I moved to a new apartment. Turns out Otto Stark is my new next door neighbor. I haven't met him yet. I've only seen like 3 Bigfoot-like glimpses of the guy. But he's got a yard full of rusted bird cages and naked statues. There's a totem pole out there. I'm totally going to trick or treat at his house this Halloween. If I put on a mask, you won't know that I'm a fool. On the right, the Reed Murdoch building from 1912, part of what they called the Prairie School of Architecture back then. One thing Prairie School architects tended to believe was that the outside of a building should reflect what goes on inside. These design elements in between the windows are supposed to be wheat shafts because this was a grocery warehouse. The clock tower, which covered up the water tower, was originally right smack in the middle of the building. It's a little bit off-center now if you really look carefully, because they had to lop off part of the building when they added this low bridge. See what I did there? This is usually about the lowest bridge. Not too bad today, I guess. I'll still talk. Low bridge, look out. So there wasn't always a bridge here at all. It used to be that when you passed the river on LaSalle, you went underneath it. They dug out a tunnel way back before the Great Chicago Fire in 1870. They still used it for streetcars up through the 50s. 57, they filled it up with damp sand, but it's still down there. There's actually a lot of tunnels like that. 40 feet below the loop, there's 60 miles of old freight tunnels they used to connect every major building. They're not very accessible now, but they're still down there. In the Gulf Coast, there's a mile of old brick tunnels from the 1850s that a brewer was using for aging his beer in the summertime. And they're presumably still there, but nobody knows exactly where anymore. It's one of our great unsolved mysteries. Okay, here's a low bridge again. Okay, this one seems lower than usual today. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And on the right, the Merchandise Mart from 1930 by Graham Anderson Probes in white in the Art Deco style. It's not quite as flashy as what I normally think of when I think Art Deco, but you got to remember this was built to be a warehouse. When I think of warehouses, I usually think of like corrugated metal and aluminum siding. This was built for the Marshall Field Company. They had 13 small warehouses, decided that one big one was better than 13 little ones. So they ended up with this 4 million square foot building. That's about the same square footage as the Sears Tower. These things out front that look like giant Pez dispensers are busts of the giants of merchandising. Guys like Marshall Field himself, Montgomery Ward is up there. I always wish you could put a quarter in a slot and make them talk. They get Marshall Field and they're going, I'm Marshall Field. I thought I was so great, but I got all my good ideas from Harry Selfridge, then gave him no credit whatsoever. I don't know why I think Marshall Field laughed like the Count from Sesame Street, but I decided that a while ago, I'm sticking to it. Alright, so I mentioned a while ago, we have to be kind of creative to make all of this stuff work. Remember the parking garages over here at the River Bend building? There's such a narrow building you can't turn cars around, and so there's an elevator that brings cars to the different levels. We've been experimenting with car elevators in the city since the 20s. Directly in front you can see all of these portholes underneath the River Point building. Those are tied in visually to the 333 Whacker here, but if you look carefully inside you might be able to see some fans that are pumping out diesel exhaust fumes from the railroad tracks they've got hidden behind the wall there. A lot of these buildings are built on what's called air rights. Back in the 20s, the railroads figured out they could make extra money by selling the rights to the air up above the tracks for people to build on. You just had to leave room in the building for a train to go through and somehow still have it be structurally sound. It wasn't that easy, but they pulled it off over and over. And speaking of difficult feats of engineering, right ahead of us here, we've got this one that looks like it's got a wedge chopped out of it. 150 North Riverside by Getch Partners, just opened a couple of years ago. Now that said, that stone portion in the middle represents the entire footprint of land they had to work with. A low bridge coming up here. Low bridge, guys. So it sat empty for decades because nobody could figure out what they could build that only filled up that amount of space. So finally, Getch Partners figured out they could build what was called a core-supported building. That stone, they covered the entire footprint with that stone portion, then let it rise up enough out of everything's way, all the stuff they had to stay away from, then flare outwards, creating their own space up in the sky. Tremendous feat of engineering here. Now I mentioned earlier about give, the way buildings kind of move in the wind. This one is especially vulnerable to that. So to lessen the effects, they've got what is called a liquid-tuned mass damper. What that is really is a giant tank of water that's built so that when the wind blows one way, the water will flow the other way to keep everything steady. It's ingenious engineering, but it's really so simple if you think about it. It's like something the ancient Romans might have done. If the ancient Romans could build 750-foot tall skyscrapers, which they could not. Not having access to William LeBaron-Jenney and the concept of steel frame construction. Now we'll get back to the postmodern era a little bit here with the Boeing building at 100 North Riverside by Perkins and Will, originally the Morton Salt building. Now this is another air rights building. Sometimes we can see the lights of the trains going by in these grates that they've got cleverly hidden behind the bushes there. Now you might notice there's a taller portion of the building, and then to the left there's a smaller portion. That smaller portion is built over the part of the tracks where the tracks cross over each other. That didn't leave them as much room as they would normally want to have for support beams and columns to hold the building up. So instead there are steel trusses up on the roof that attach it to the next portion of the building. So effectively this smaller part is being dangled off of the lower part. So it turned a lot of heads when they first built it, when people weren't entirely sure it was going to work. But it's still standing. So far. And on the right, back to the Art Deco era with the Chicago Daily News building by Hullibird and Root. Now, this was one of the first skyscrapers to have a public veranda out front, which is kind of a new idea then, kind of an odd one considering that Madison Street in those days was known as Skid Row. In fact, there's a terrific novel from the 40s called Knock on Any Door by Willard Motley. It's the origin of the phrase, live fast, die young, and have a good-looking corpse. Every other page of that book, somebody is getting mugged in the veranda outside the Daily News building. Now, the Daily News stopped being published back in the 1970s. Only a few years have ever even been digitized. But if you go to the Harold Washington Library, the third floor microfilm room has a complete run of the Daily News, as well as the Chicago Post, the Chicago Press, the Chicago Times, the Chicago Herald, the Chicago Journal, the Chicago Chronicle, the Chicago Globe, Chicago Mail, Chicago Daily Inter-Ocean, Chicago Gem of the Prairie, Chicago Democratic Press, Chicago Evening American. Chicago Dispatch they only have on paper, and they won't let anybody see it because it's falling apart, and that drives me nuts. Toronto is especially bad for not digitizing their newspapers, too. I spend more time looking up old newspapers than I should probably admit. But earlier on, I talked about how sometimes they like the outside of a building to reflect what goes on inside. Coming up on the left here, just on the other side of the Monroe Street Bridge, this is the old Hartford Insurance building from the early 60s. Here you can see the strength of the exterior stone is protecting the fragility of the interior glass, the same way the strength of a Hartford Insurance policy protects your fragile life. Maybe, I don't know. I couldn't find a lot of good data about the Hartford Insurance building. Well, one thing I did find, though, is Hartford Insurance is one of about half a dozen insurance companies in the city that in the 1890s got caught up in the swindles and schemes of H.H. Holmes, the Devil in the White City guy. We tend to advertise him as America's first known serial killer, which is honestly not remotely true. He probably wasn't even the first one in Chicago. I ended up doing a 600-page book about that guy. The paperwork from all the times he got sued was on file. When he added a third story onto his building, he bought 5 different fire insurance policies on it, including one from Hartford Insurance. Then, strangely enough, 2 months later, the building caught fire. Not one of the insurance companies was actually fooled. One of our most audacious swindlers, not one of our better ones. To the right, the smaller black one is another Fosler Kahn design that the Tribune, that might have also been an idea where the outside reflects the inside. When it opened in the early 70s, the Tribune described this as like a small black box heavily strapped with steel cables, as though it were holding in something volatile, something that had to be contained or else it would explode. Which is a pretty good description of what used to go on in there. That's where they used to have the old commodities exchange, where guys would yell and scream at each other over oat, corn, and barley deals all day. It's like doing business inside of a riot. And on the other side of the Jackson Boulevard Bridge, I used to point out this building as a good example of bad modernism. So as I said, a good modernist building, you can never see the seams, never see the screws. Here you can see all of them. And originally they just had a beige slab over the elevator shaft. The Chicago Reader called it conspicuously dull. So a couple of years ago, they got tired of being conspicuously dull and added this design over the elevator shaft. And what this design is a map of the Chicago River. That red rectangle in the middle there is the "You Are Here" portion. So right now we are just to the left of that rectangle, making our way further downstairs. And I love that they did that. For their own purposes, it made the building infinitely more desirable as a location almost overnight. It's a great example of what a tiny bit of design goes a really long way. And for my purposes, it made the building a lot more fun to talk about than it used to be. I used to just go on and on about how bad that building was. Now I get to say some cool things about it, too. I'd rather talk about a building I like than one that I don't any day. So, this one coming up on the right here, for a while I was telling people this one might be cursed. This is the old post office by Graham Anderson, Probst and White from 1930. In 1930, it was top of the line. It's an air rights building so trains could pick up mail right underneath. And up on the roof was a landing pad for autogyros, early versions of helicopters that would go back and forth to the airport with mail. Eventually they graduated to regular helicopters. But they couldn't make all of the technological improvements over the years quite as well as they could with that. So by the 1960s, people were saying it had already outlived its usefulness. In the 90s, they built a more streamlined post office a little further down. So that one has now been sitting empty for more than 20 years. It went through developer after developer and plan after plan and idea after idea, but the plan would fall apart, the developer would run out of money, or the developer would turn out to be a con artist, caught fire several times. But now Bear Construction has been working on turning it all into offices for a couple of years. They're making really good progress. I understand the first tenants are going to be moving in any day now. There's also talk of having a park up on the roof, which would be really cool too. So it was kind of a surprise they went for offices, though. The big thing in the loop lately has been either building or rehabbing things into residential buildings. In fact, they're building so many residential buildings these days, some people are saying it's going to start driving rents down. I'll believe that when I see it. I'd love it if that were true. I just got priced out of the apartment I'd had for 15 years. But really the real trend has been what they call mixed use. Like this whole new development on the left here is going to be mostly residential, but also some retail and restaurant space. A little further down, we'll see a place called the Roosevelt Collection, which is a movie theater plus mall shops and apartments. It's like you actually get to live at the mall. But if you think about that, it's really kind of a throwback to Bertrand Goldberg and his idea of a city within a city. If you remember Marina City, those corncob buildings, you might recognize some of his architectural style in the place where he picked you up in the first place, River City. One of the last of the great brutalist buildings, 1980s. Now, he had been designing that one for about 20 years. It's fairly late brutalism. Originally, he wanted it to be much taller than this. Had to scale back a bit, but it's still pretty much a city within a city here. It's mostly residential, but there's also a preschool in there. There's a doctor's office in there. There's a grocery store that is about 50% booze. And right across the hall from the preschool. Just the way it ought to be. Now, okay, the one thing that I think I've been asked the most over the years doing these tours is which of these buildings was Al Capone? And for the longest time I told people there's a lot of urban legends. The real answer is probably none of them. There's only a few places we can actually trace that guy to. However, as we approach River City, if you take a look down the street in front of it, you take a look down Polk Street here, for just a second, you'll be able to see this red brick clock tower a couple of blocks down. You see it? That is called Dearborn Station. I was able to verify that Al Capone changed trains on the way to prison at Dearborn Station. So I could trace into that one anyway. And speaking of his era, right in front of us, in Springsteen's words, them smokestacks reaching like the arms of God into the beautiful sky of soot and clay. This is a power plant from 1930, built with Art Deco design elements. It's got that streamlined verticality and simple geometric art that we associate with Art Deco. This was specifically by Graham Anderson probes in white too. I think it speaks very well of the city that in 1930, even as the Depression was rolling around, they were using Graham Anderson probes in white. Same people who made the Wrigley Building and the Merchandise Mart to do a power plant. And I understand that that power plant even still serves a couple of those buildings nearby here, providing power to this team. Now, I have never actually seen anything coming out of the smokestacks, but that may just not be how it works anymore. You can probably tell I'm not an engineer. I'm just a historian. But speaking of history stuff, let's go back in time a little bit. October 6th, 1871. Wealthy Chicago merchant Barton Edsall is found lying dead in the entryway of his North Side mansion. For 3 days, all anybody can talk about is how did Barton Edsall really die? Was it a murder? Was it a suicide? Did he accidentally shoot himself in the head? So there's evidence for all three of these theories, but nothing really concrete. Finally, on the third day, he is buried in a small ceremony at Graceland Cemetery. Newspapers go to press that morning saying, "We are still going to get to the bottom of this. We will not forget about Barton Edsall." That night, the Great Chicago Fire burned down the entire city, and everybody forgot about Barton Edsall completely. He didn't make it into a Chicago history book for just about 150 years after all of this. Now, if you take a look through these trees here on the right, through the trees you'll see a bit of the Whole Foods. There's a DSW Shoes. If you were to walk just a little ways past that, you'd be right about in the airspace where Mrs. O'Leary's cottage and barn were, where the Great Chicago Fire began. Now, that should have been just a regular barn fire, the kind of thing that happened pretty much every day. But there were a couple of factors working against it. One is it had just been a very dry summer. If you look at early October 1871 newspapers, they are just plastered with ads for fire insurance. Also, the fire department had used up all of their resources the night before fighting another fire in the West Division. So what should have been a regular barn fire here ended up burning and spreading all the way to the river. And then it jumped across the river. And having jumped across the river, it took a left-hand turn, burned all the way up to Lincoln Park, 3 miles north of here, destroying 16,000 buildings in its path. Now, it could have also taken the right-hand turn, burned all the way down to the south side as well. Luckily, General Philip Sheridan from the Civil War was on hand. He saw what was happening, managed to procure a whole bunch of dynamite, and blew up several south side buildings so the fire wouldn't have a place to spread. The owners were rather annoyed. But if he hadn't blown up their buildings, they were just going to burn down anyway. So I would call him kind of an unsung hero, but we do have a massive street named after the guy, Sheridan Street. He's got pretty good sound out of that thing. Alright, so to this day, we don't really know what actually started the Great Chicago Fire. For years, everybody was taught that dumb old Mrs. O'Leary left a kerosene lantern next to the cow, and the cow kicked it over, and that started the fire. But that was fake news. That was invented by a racist newspaper editor named Wilbur F. Story. He ran the Chicago Times. They had been the anti-Lincoln paper during the Civil War. He once described one of Lincoln's speeches as the silly, flat, and dishwatery utterances of an unintelligent man. And that speech was the Gettysburg Address. Later on, he needed a new target to pick on, so he was mostly picking on the Irish. He described Mrs. O'Leary as a 70-year-old Irish hag and said that she had deliberately burned down the city because they were cutting off her pension. Now, Mrs. O'Leary was a real person, but she was only 35 years old at the time when he was calling her an old hag. Certainly had never gotten a pension before. So, nowadays, when I run Rose Hill Cemetery walking tours now, we all dance on Wilbur F. Story's grave. It's awesome. So to this day, we don't know what really started the fire. There could have been something as simple as a lightning strike. There are some stories about kids sneaking into that barn to steal milk from the cow to make whiskey punch and then dropping a pipe as they left. There was also a guy in the neighborhood. The first person to report the fire was a disreputable character named Pegleg Sullivan, whose actual story about where he was that night never exactly added up. Then 10 years after the fire, a book came out called Ragnarok, The Age of Fire and Gravel. And this book put forth the proposition that what had really happened that day was a meteor had hit the city. And that started the fire. And furthermore, it went on to say that 6,000 years ago, another meteor struck the Earth and sunk the entire continent of Atlantis and wiped out a whole advanced civilization on Earth. Which at the time was even weirder. Nobody had ever said that Atlantis was a real place at the time that he came up with this. You can still get Ragnarok, The Age of Fire and Gravel for free on Google Books. It's a really fun read, honestly. I don't know if it was, scientists now generally agree that a meteor would not really start a fire like that. But I don't know if it was on the History Channel or what, because that theory is everywhere now. You cannot talk about the origins of the Great Chicago Fire without somebody bringing up the meteor these days. Now, personally, the most persuasive story I've ever heard came from Mrs. O'Leary's son, James. James O'Leary grew up to be a gambling kingpin known as Big Jim O'Leary, one of a couple of kingpins named Big Jim that we had in the city at the time. Now, years after the fire, he had this floating gambling parlor. It was a gambling parlor on wheels that people would find now and then. One year, some reporters came into it and said, "So, Jim, would you like to clear up the story about what really happened that day of the fire?" And he said that what really happened was the green hay in the hayloft had spontaneously combusted. Which wouldn't sound that scientific to me, but farmer after farmer has come up to me after these tours and, "Oh yeah, hay actually does spontaneously combust sometimes." So that's about as close as we can get to an eyewitness statement. Trouble is, Big Jim O'Leary was 2 years old when all of this happened. So he's not exactly a reliable witness, but we would have had the family stories. That's probably about as close as we're going to get. Now, he had a couple of different gambling parlors as an adult. The floating one probably would have been set up generally around the space where we are right now, because we're starting to get into an area now where 100 years ago, fine, upstanding people like yourselves would not have been seen. A little bit further back was an area called Whiskey Row. Below Whiskey Row was Hell's Half Acre. Below Hell's Half Acre was Satan's Mile. Down below Satan's Mile, you came into the Levee District where the bars had names like the Bucket of Blood and Bedbug Row. Right in the middle, if you look at these curving buildings out there, another Bertrand Goldberg design, right about where those are now was a place called Big Jim Calissimo's Cafe, one of our other Big Jims. Big Jim was kind of the big vice lord of the 1910s. In 1922, the Tribune described his place as the place where daughters of shadows dance in the arms of the underworld, while the worshippers call toward their golden idol, jazz. And from every window can be heard the sob of the saxophone, the symbol of lost souls who drift to the port of missing men. That reporter would have loved video games. But Big Jim, by the time they wrote that, Big Jim, hey, congratulations! So Big Jim was already dead by the time that was written. A couple of years before, he had been the vice lord of Chicago. If you ran a gambling racket or a numbers racket or something, you were paying off Big Jim. But 1920 came around and Prohibition got started. Every gangster saw dollar signs in their eyes. But Big Jim had just gotten married to one of his chorus girls. So he gathered everybody together and said, "Listen, guys, my wife wants me to straighten up, and by gum, I'm going to do it. So we're still going to have the gambling parlors and everything, but we are not going to do bootleg liquor, not here in Chicago." Shortly after saying that, Big Jim was found shot to death in the middle of his cafe by an assailant who was never identified, partly because absolutely everybody seemed to have a motive for it. When they asked his widow, "Do you suspect anyone?" she said, "Well, really, I suspect everyone." So every gangster had dollar signs in their eyes. After that, John Torrio took over the Vice District, gathered everybody together, said, "Yes, we are definitely doing bootleg liquor, but we're not going to fight about it. We'll just divide the city into territories. You take yours, we'll take ours." It actually worked for a few years, until finally the Jenner brothers shot Dino Banyan. The Southsiders decided to get revenge, then the Northsiders got revenge again by coming after John Torrio himself. He retired and turned everything over to Al Capone, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, as I said, most of the bridges are bascule bridges. They open up in the middle. It's hard to do the hand motion when I've got a microphone in my hand. But this one is one of my favorites, the Canal Street Vertical Lift Bridge. Now, with this one, the entire bridge lifts up in between these two towers. Now, 100 years ago, when it was a brand new bridge, it would go up and down about between 70 and 90 times a day, they say. This is a low enough bridge to start with, and most of the ships couldn't get underneath it. This one could not get underneath it without radioing ahead. The house that you see up there is primarily mechanical stuff, but there is about 100 square feet where the bridge tender used to hang out and ride up and down 70 to 90 times a day. Now they've got the bridge tender station about a block away, but it still does go up and down to this day. Not 70 to 90 times a day anymore, but about every 3 weeks I'll out here and see it going up and down. Just about every 3 weeks, I'd say. I mean, I'm sure it goes up and down times when I'm not here. I love the towers on the side, too. They remind me of Donkey Kong. I'd like me to stay off mic for just a second here while we turn. I'm not sure why, some kind of old marine superstition.